My father was career military. He was a navigator and a radar expert in the United States Air Force. He spent most of his career fighting the Cold War. He retired a lieutenant colonel in the early 70s. I don't recall exactly what year. He and my mother were divorced many years earlier when I was in grade school, and my mother remarried, and she had my half-brother Philip when I was 10 years old, and whom I just adore. Phil's father died when Phil was 12. I had moved away from home by then, but I clearly remember that when still in high school, my little beloved brother, DeLay, enlisted in the active duty Air Force. At first, my mother refused to sign the necessary waiver, but when she could see that he was determined, she relented. And when she told me, I was angry with her for what I saw as letting him sign his life away. Well, the truth is that military service was the best thing that ever happened to my father and my half-brother. My father was a smart guy with a photographic memory. He enlisted, but it wasn't long before he went to officer candidate school. His parents, my grandparents, were agrarians, and they were living a meager existence in Oklahoma. So my father, through his military service, escaped that poverty and found vocational fulfillment through his military service. Today, my brother says that he can't imagine how his life could have turned out any better had he not enlisted. Even though Philip was not related to my father and they had little interaction, his career actually kind of mirrored my father's. He enlisted, of course, at 17, but he didn't actually go into active service until 18, but he got credit for that year that he was in high school in ROTC. But he went on to officer, he got his degree, his bachelor's degree, and he went on to officer's candidate school and had 25 years, a 25-year career. He retired a major, and he now teaches junior ROTC in West Virginia. Now, Phil sees many of his students find success through military service. Today, however, his students are much more likely to enter the military duty as reservists, so-called weekend warriors. However, as conflicts such as Iraqi freedom and US military operations in Afghanistan have arisen these past 3 decades, reservists found themselves deployed, often as combatants. This is no accident, according to my brother. In our country's history of warfare, World War I and World War II soldiers came home to parades. Soldiers serving in Korea came home to indifference, and soldiers serving in Vietnam came home to open hostility. The US involvement in Southeast Asia, the military ops there, my brother says were protracted, low-intensity conflicts with no clear mission, no definitive outcomes, ending in withdrawals that were badly executed. A very low percentage of military personnel in these conflicts were reservists. Most were career military and draftees. And so looking back on that hostility shown veterans in the Vietnam War, it's theorized that civilians looked upon returning soldiers as professional or mercenary, and they were judged harshly against grisly campaigns like the My Lai massacre. It was unfair. While it's hard to imagine we as a country could repeat those mistakes, my brother said that military conflicts in the Middle East are in fact very similar in terms of being low intensity, and they had poorly executed endings. But one lesson was learned from Vietnam. The Pentagon decided to use reservists in the Middle East because it would make stakeholders out of a wider percentage of civilians, because it was husbands and brothers and friends and sisters and fathers and mothers and cousins and employees that were being deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. And this is not to say that there were no active duty personnel on the ground. As a matter of fact, my brother did a tour of duty in Afghanistan. But regular deployment of reservists had the overall effect of humanizing military personnel and bringing home awareness of far-off military operations. Now think back to the attention and the support received in the press, in social media, in organized receptions at airports, on the part of civic organizations, religious institutions, and the public in general. Do you remember yellow ribbons? Right? So public support of the military in the past couple of decades has never been more robust. And of course, no matter what, it is deserved. And Vietnam vets did not and do not deserve mistreatment by anyone. I think time has told us that. But we cannot discount the effectiveness of deploying reservists to the front lines of military combat in terms of the public support of these conflicts. Now, my brother will tell you that whenever he is in uniform, he receives thanks from strangers for his service to the country. He says he has mixed feelings about these accolades. First, he says the country has done far more for him than he has for the country. And he says one must be mindful of the effect of blanket hero worship. After all, he's no longer active duty, but most civilians, including myself, can't tell the difference. I can't tell that it's an ROTC uniform. There's also a reality to warfare that should not be romanticized. Military service is duty before it is anything else. And people are called to that duty for many different reasons. Now, by and large, most military personnel never see combat. And military operations and strategies have changed greatly in recent decades, and casualties among American soldiers have been surprisingly low. I'm not sure we can say the same about those on the other side of the conflict. However, military duty always carries with it a chance of moral injury. So let me talk a little bit about a author and academic named Dave Grossman. He's Lieutenant Colonel, retired from the Army. He was a Ranger and a paratrooper. So in 1995, he published a book called On Killing, the psychological cost of learning to kill in war and society. Now, the upshot of Grossman's book is this: human beings are loath to kill each other, even in military battle. He discovered this when he was studying the low rates of fatalities relative to the firepower of the Civil War, and also the inordinately high number of undischarged firearms reported on the front lines. So he discovered that even though soldiers were trained to load and fire their musket arms in their sleep, and they could do it pretty quickly, he said that what happened is that when they were faced with the opposition, they would either shoot up into the air, over the heads, or not at all. Now, there were exceptions, of course, but this was almost the norm. So it indicates that there's a resistance in us to take the life of another, especially when we are in proximity to them. And so if you made eye contact with, across the field, or you could see your enemy on the other side of you, your soldiers were far less inclined to actually take the lives that they could have. It was a fraction. So military leaders began to realize that this disinclination to kill a fellow human being, the military began to devise ways to overcome this natural resistance. And two key pieces of this were physical and emotional distancing. So it's far more, it's easier to kill when you can't see your enemy. And of course, advances in weaponry in the last century has made trading volleys of rifle fire across open fields obsolete. Yet in combat, there still exists close encounters with the enemy, so that then emotional distancing becomes necessary, including dehumanizing the enemy. I don't need to tell those of you who serve the pejoratives that were used when referring to the opposition, and also the efforts to dehumanize them. There was also moral distancing, which involves legitimizing one's own position while criminalizing the enemy's. And then finally, moral justification for war, and this is common, has been with us around for millennia and has legitimized the taking of human lives. There's many Old Testament references to this difference between killing in the line of military duty and the wanton taking of a life, murder. But Grossman says that despite this training, he's witnessed in combat veterans what he calls a piercing of the veil of denial. So here's a story, an example. A World War II vet told him that he was nearly gutted by a Japanese soldier charging at him with a bayonet. The American soldier felled the Japanese soldier with a pistol. Now, they were obliged to check through the belongings, the pockets of the enemy for any possible intelligence. And in doing so, the American soldier found a picture of the dead man's wife and 2 children. And this had the effect of immediately rehumanizing his attacker in a concrete way. The veil of denial in that case was irrevocably pierced for that World War II veteran. And even though these are not Dave Grossman's words, they're actually, I think, coined by Rebecca Parker in Proverbs of Ashes, there's a moral injury there. The effects of the physical and emotional distancing have culminated in a dramatic way in modern day military conflict. Now, this story came to me from my husband, who is very involved in what has been called unmanned aircraft. It's actually, they're actually a euphemism for a drone. They have lots of commercial applications, the small ones do. But nowadays, they're calling it uncrewed aviation. And the advances in uncrewed aviation in the military has been remarkable. Drones with wingspans of up to 130 feet wide are used to carry out operations. Some of them carry missiles and can now be deployed against targets in the Middle East by drone pilots sitting in military installations in the United States. So here's a story about a drone pilot who, in Las Vegas, Nevada, deployed a missile-armed drone on a known terrorist cell in Afghanistan and was successful. He left his post that day and went home to his daughter's birthday party, but his deed haunted him as he couldn't reconcile his act of warfare with the bright sunshine, the safety, the civility, and the innocence of his daughter's birthday celebration. The drone pilot experienced a moment of profound cognitive dissonance, which led to an emotional breakdown for this young man. So despite the most physical and emotional distancing, you don't see people. You're mostly targeting buildings and structures. So the maximum physical and emotional distancing still leads, or still can lead, to a piercing of that veil of denial that many human beings find hard to reconcile, because that's just not our nature. So even distanced combatants can experience moral injury, and in this case, it was a PTSD in one single incident. So historically, Unitarians and Universalists have supported what has been viewed as the humanitarian war effort. Think about World War II, saving innocent lives. But the Vietnam War brought about protests and use of congregational buildings and grounds as symbolic sanctuaries for draftees of the time. There's been a wide range of positions from pacifists to active duty personnel among us. In UU ministry, there are scores of military chaplains, both active duty and reservists. We have an affiliated minister, the Reverend John Smith, who is an Army Reserve chaplain. He is the one who pointed out this idea of moral injury, that you may not have any physical scars, but you can still experience, and at the core of your human being, a dissonance between your military duty and who you are at your core. So this is something that we need to pay attention to. And at the same time, as we have studied, as the Unitarian Universalist Association and folks in congregations have studied recent military conflict and engagement, the use of these drones, that they have in 2010 changed, went from approving a humanitarian war to being proactive peacemakers. And this shift came in the form of a statement of conscience, which is issued to create peace and engage in peacemaking at all levels of society, from our family units to our congregations to our larger society, so societal institutions. And based on the theological principles of the interdependence of all life, the inherent worth, dignity, and freedom of our fellow human beings, these belie an unstudied engagement in warfare. In addition, the relational qualities of love, cooperation, and justice-seeking call us to be peacemakers. And finally, there's a very specific rejection of a just war. Rejecting what is couched as moral dualism, and that's the mindset that issues of conflict can be labeled simplistically as good versus evil. Moral dualism can blind us to our own capacity for evil and to the inherent good in our so-called enemies. We understand that there's gray areas, right? There's no absolutes. The Dalai Lama says simply that war is obsolete, and with that, I would agree. Yet we live in an imperfect world of imperfect human beings who get it wrong again and again. So yet we live with military conflict as humanity has for millennia. We honor and thank our veterans for their service, remembering that it is not by their will alone that our country engages in conflict with other nations. The military serves at the behest of the commander-in-chief, whom we elect. Thus, we all have a hand in opting war over peace. So today, let us honor among us our military veterans, and at the same time, let us also strive to be peacemakers in as many spheres of our lives as possible and work towards making warfare obsolete. May it be so. And now I would like to read all of the veterans that I have been informed of and am aware of in our congregation. If you would like, if you so choose, you may stand when your name is called. You don't have to. Elon Bateman, Carolyn Brown, Robert Cadwell, Charles Cormier, Sharon Drew, William Jensen, Paul Liebert, Cliff Lufton, Emil Kessler, Richard Mersitz, James Smith, and Stover Snook. We thank you for your service. And now Jim is going to recite a reading of thanks.
Before I do, in the interest of full disclosure, I'd like to say that in the abstract, it's great to think of yourself as a peacemaker, but when faced with a choice of him or you, it's not always easy to be a peacemaker. And I only fired 6 rounds in Vietnam, and they were all at a target, but I had to pull guard duty and I had to carry a loaded M16 on all my forays into the bush. And on guard duty one time, I was patrolling an enlisted man's club, and in the dark, I saw what I thought was somebody sneaking around the back door. And I just mechanically pulled my weapon off my shoulder, clicked the safety on, raised it, and the guy came into the light, and it was a worker at the club who had come out for a cigarette. And I just immediately pointed the weapon down, put the safety back on, and just hugged the guy and said, "Boy, you scared the hell out of me." And I think I was about to blow him away if he had made one more move. And here is some prose from Ren Bellavance Grace, and it's called On Veterans Day. And she begins with a quote: "If the only prayer you ever say in your entire life is thank you, it will be enough." And that's from Meister Eckhart. Today we have set aside time to publicly thank you to our siblings who have served in the Air Force, Army, Coast Guard, Navy, and Marines, to say thank you to all who served, whatever their role, wherever their service took them. We say thank you to those whose service was brief and to those who made a career of their service. We say thank you to those who remember their service with fondness and to those whose time in service still haunts them. We say thank you to those who returned to us largely intact, who found jobs, started families, and who continue to find ways to serve their communities. We say thank you to veterans who return with brokenness so deep that they continue to struggle to find a role or even a home in our communities. God of many names, source of love, in the face of all this, sometimes the only prayer we have is thank you. We pray it will be enough.